Do your battle maps only have 3 things? The players, the enemies, and a flat level playing field in which they battle on? Well, your terrain is boring. If you'd like to make your terrain more interesting and more exciting, stick to the end of this video. I'll give you 5 tips in order to make your terrain more interesting. Welcome back, storytellers. My name is Khalil Robeson, a seasoned dungeon master, here to help you pursue your fantasy. And in today's video, we're going to be continuing the interesting combat series, which, if you haven't watched the other videos in the series, go ahead and click this iCard up over here, and you gotta make sure you watch all those other videos in order to understand what the acronym TTSN means. But in today's video, we're going to be discussing on how to make your terrain interesting in order to then make yourself have interesting combat. So, without further ado, let's get into it. If you're a newer dungeon master or you're just getting into D&D and you don't understand all of the terms and jargon, basically all terrain is where the players are fighting. Whether or not that means they're fighting on the back of a flying dragon, or on the ground in a forest, or in a dungeon. All terrain is the area in which the players are fighting. So, let's get into it now that we've cleared the air. Tip number 1 is to limit their passives. What do I mean by passives? Passives are things that your players aren't actively thinking about or aren't actively managing themselves. So the first type of passive that you can easily limit is their senses. So we have 5 main senses that we actually use in order to interact with the world around us. Try to limit any of those senses, whether or not that means that they lose their sight because this area is super bright and they just can't see anything, and now they have to use their perception or their hearing in order to navigate this fighting area, in which you can change their armor class from having a dex modifier to having a perception modifier on it instead, which would be really cool and really different. Or what if they can't smell anything? Their sense of smell is really the most important thing to know where this creature or where this fight is happening. Or maybe they can't touch anything because that everything is a little bit wonky and they can't really move as well and they can't really attack as well. Maybe they can't hear anything, which, I mean, kiss all verbal spells goodbye, because you can't hear if you're doing the spells right or not, which means that your spells may fail because you're not doing them correctly. Whatever it is, find some way in order to limit their senses in order to make this terrain more interesting. And another way that you can limit a passive is to limit their movement. Whether or not that means that they're trudging through mountains of snow, so it's a lot harder to move to their combatants, or if they're on a boat which is moving and they're fighting other boats, but they can't move off of this boat and have to wait for the boat to move on the first turn of initiative order. Whatever it is, find some way to limit their movement, and that'll just make it so much more interesting, so much more dynamic. Tip number 2 is to limit their resources. So whatever way you can, try to find some way in order to limit your party's resources, either by limiting them and making them harder to use, or by completely stripping them away from them and forcing your players to think differently. Whether or not that means that there's a bunch of wind blowing in this area so the arrows aren't really hitting their mark, or there's a wild magic or even anti-magic field in this area so the wizard spells are either not hitting or they're completely turning into something completely different, or there's just a field of chaos in this area so melee attacks just bouncing and rebounding to wherever that they want to. Whatever it is, find some way in order to limit or restrict resources from your players, and this will just add an extra layer of dynamic to the battle. But be careful you don't do this too heavily or too much, or don't do it in a certain way, because you may accidentally make your players feel like their agency is being ripped away from them. And if you want to watch a video on where I describe how to make sure your players perceive that they're having agency, watch this video in the iCard over here. Let's move on to the next tip. Number 3 is to give unique scenery. So either describe before the fight the scenery of them fighting on the back of this dragon as they're trying to take down the storm giant that wants to destroy their ally, or as they're underneath the water and they're fighting millions of sharks, how the blood is how the water is slowly turning red from all the blood that is spilling, and they can taste the iron in their mouth. Or if they're fighting in this mushroom forest and every single time their blades hit each other, the ringing of the metal is what's causing these mushrooms to shoot this vibrant liquid or even spores. Whatever it is, try to describe your scenery as very unique and very different, and that is what will make your terrain in combat interesting. Tip number 4 is to drain your party's resources. Now, this might sound like the tip number 2, but it's not. The difference between this one and tip number 2 is that over time and steadily, you are slowly taking away the resources that your party has. Whether or not that means you're slowly draining away their life, their armor, their attacks, their damage, their sanity, whatever it is, you're draining their resources over time. But be careful when you do this, because the first thing you have to do when you do this is foreshadow the draining of their resource, either by explicitly telling the players through some NPC or through their investigations of this area that this area will drain your resources, as it's either an anti-magic field or a desecrated area in which it is trying to sap away life in order to become whole once more. Whatever it is, you have to foreshadow it to your players, or else they'll just feel like, oh, DM just pulling another trick out of his sleeve and being mean. You just foreshadow this, and it'll just make your terrain interesting and just come alive. Literally. Number 5 is to change your terrain. Now, you can change your terrain by having your players fight some large monstrous being that is literally ripping apart your forest area, creating hills with its punches, leveling trees that are starting to create barricades, creating mountains with the sand that is kicking up when it kicks them and misses. whatever it is, make it so the creature itself is slowly changing the terrain over time, and that'll just add a lot more epicness and interesting as the creature itself is changing the terrain, and the players have to constantly proactively think of new ways in order to tackle the new terrain in front of them. Or, very simply, have your creature be some sort of spellcaster that's casting Mirage Arcanum or Mirage Arcane, whatever it is, but have them literally change the terrain and make it so that the players are like, oh wow, the terrain is going from this woodsy area to where now we're underneath the water, to now we're flying on the back of a dragon, to now we are literally in the pit of magma as there are these small floating rocks that are the only things that are keeping us from being burnt alive. Whatever it is, find some way to either drastically change your terrain or change it over time. Terrain is probably the most underutilized and undervalued thing when it comes to making a set-piece battle in D&D or any tabletop role-playing game. If you really just put a little bit of effort into your terrain, you'll see that your players will just enjoy the combat, not even for the sake of them fighting the creature, but for the fact that the area that they're fighting in is epic. Remember, your players are trying to suspend their beliefs of this not being a real world. They want to engage with the fantasy and engage with this place that you're making for them. So make it more descriptive, make it changing, make it evolve as they're fighting in order to keep them in there and keep them inside of the suspension of belief. Ow, I just hit my eye. Keep them in the suspension of belief and help them just want to be here and just thinking about this terrain as a whole. If you'd like to join a community of storytellers, which all we do is discuss this stuff, go ahead and click the link in the description below and join our Discord server. If you really like this video, please feel free to sneak attack that like button. And if you really liked it, please feel free to subscribe as I post new content on this channel just like this every single week. And if you just want to, share your love and tell me how well you think you are now going to use terrain inside of your campaigns, go ahead and comment that down in the comment section below. But nonetheless, I love you guys. I hope you have a fantastic day. And in a world without fantasy, sometimes we need a little Dungeons and Dragons.